Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking into something quite intricate, often unsettling, corporate psychopathy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you hear psychopath, you probably picture, well, a violent criminal.
Right, that's the common image.
But our sources suggest something different. A surprisingly significant presence of individuals with these traits within corporate environments. Maybe around 4%, actually.
Yeah, it's not some, fringe thing. It's substantial enough that we really need to look at what it means for workplaces, for the people working there.
Absolutely. So this deep dive, we're aiming to explore that presence, the impact, but with a calm, critically insightful lens.
Exactly. We want to get past the, let's say, sensationalism and really understand how these traits show up, the consequences, and maybe how we can navigate these dynamics better. No hyperbole.
Okay, so let's start with how these individuals actually operate day to day, identifying them. It sounds really challenging because on the surface, they can be quite appealing.
Very much so. Often charming, charismatic, they make a great first impression.
But the sources consistently say that underneath that veneer, there's this profound lack of empathy, a real coldness, and it's just deep-seated self-centeredness driving their actions.
That's the core of it.
So what are some of the maybe subtler signs we should be aware of, beyond just the surface charm?
Well, the sources point to a few key things. That lack of empathy is huge. And it's not just, being insensitive sometimes.
Right.
It's a consistent failure to really grasp or share what others are feeling. It might be subtle, like total indifference if a colleague is going through something tough.
Or even using that vulnerability.
Potentially, yeah. Leveraging it for their own gain. It's not always dramatic, just this constant detachment.
That's a key difference, that quiet disregard, like you said, almost an absence of a normal human reaction.
Exactly.
And then the self-centeredness. Okay, ambition's normal in business, but this sounds different. Like their own needs, their achievements are absolutely paramount.
Totally. Without real thought for others' contributions or well-being, unless
it helps them somehow.
Precisely. It's all filtered through what's in it for me. Another big flag is habitual lying. And again, not just stretching the truth now and then. The sources talk about frequent, deliberate deception, using lies to manipulate situations, all for personal benefit.
And what happens when they get caught out?
They tend to just layer on more lies, double down, rather than admit fault. Over time, though, the inconsistencies often reveal the pattern.
Like a house of cards, eventually it just, And it's not just words, it's their emotional display too, right? Or lack thereof.
Right. Emotional suppression.
Yeah.
The sources mention this unusual ability to stay calm, almost detached, even in really stressful or critical situations.
Where most people would show something.
Exactly. And when colleagues are showing strong emotions, frustration, joy, or whatever, the reaction from someone with these traits is often just marked indifference. It's like they can't connect.
That must feel really strange, almost alienating to be around.
Yeah.
Like they're just observing.
It can, yeah. It creates a real sense of unease. Then there's the classic blame shifting.
Oh yeah, I heard about that one.
Responsibility for mistakes. Almost never accepted. The sources really emphasize this consistent pattern, deflect blame onto others, subordinates, team members.
Anyone but them.
Anyone but them. Protects their image, their position, but obviously it just shreds trust within the team, within the organization.
Destroys collaboration.
Absolutely. Fosters unfairness, makes people feel constantly vulnerable. Another subtle thing the sources call out is superficial emotions.
Meaning?
Well, they might display what looks like empathy or excitement. It might even seem convincing at first glance.
Okay.
But if you look closer, it often lacks real depth. It's inconsistent or just doesn't have those little nuances of genuine feel. It's like they're performing emotion, not feeling it.
The script is right, but the delivery feels hollow.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's fearless risk-taking.
Boldness. Or something else.
The sources suggest it's often more like a disregard for consequences, for potential dangers, not just for them, but for the company, for colleagues.
So less calculated courage, more impulsivity without concern for the fallout.
That's a good way to put it. It's often impulsivity masked as courage. And finally, relationships. The sources describe them as typically shallow, transactional.
Used for personal gain.
Primarily, yes. Connections are formed because they're useful and often discarded just as quickly when they're not needed anymore. There's no real reciprocity, no genuine emotional investment.
All about utility, not connection.
Wow.
It paints a pretty bleak picture, and like you said, that initial charm can hide all this. Interestingly, the sources mention the Rorschach Test. How does that fit in? Can it actually see past the mask?
Well, that's the idea. The sources suggest the Rorschach might tap into those deeper structures because the responses aren't as consciously controlled.
Right, it's ambiguous ink blots.
Exactly. So it might reveal underlying traits like that emotional detachment, the lack of real connection that someone could otherwise hide quite effectively in, say, an interview.
So how would their responses potentially differ? What might stand out on a Rorschach?
Well, several things, potentially. One is maybe a lack of emotional or relational content in what they see. Descriptions might be very factual, detached, focus on shape or color without linking it to people, interactions, feelings. Just, it's a bat, end of story. No narrative, no emotion attached.
Which is different from how most people respond.
Often, yes. Most people tend to project some kind of human meaning or feeling onto them. So the absence of that can be telling. It might reflect reduced empathy.
Makes it, if the inner emotional world is different, the projections will be different too.
Precisely. Another thing highlighted is the potential for themes of conflict or aggression. They might see more images of fighting, destruction, predators, which could reflect some underlying tendencies.
Or a worldview based on conflict.
Possibly. Or conversely, sometimes their responses may be surprisingly simple, lacking imagination or complexity, which could point towards that sort of superficiality in how they process things.
So it offers a different kind of window, maybe less prone to manipulation.
Okay, let's shift focus. The bigger picture, the impact on the organization, especially when these individuals are in management.
Yeah, the sources are pretty clear here. The potential for destructive influence is significant. Managers with these traits can really harm the workplace environment, leading to high employee turnover.
How so? What kind of leadership style are we talking about?
Often authoritarian, controlling, demanding, dismissive of input. It creates this high-stress atmosphere.
Which drives people away.
Frequently, yes. Valued employees often leave to find somewhere more supportive.
And I imagine that's made worse by the tendency to take credit for successes but ignore contributions from the team.
Absolutely. That's incredibly demoralizing. When people feel their work isn't recognized, or worse, that their manager is stealing their credit, loyalty just plummets, engagement drops.
A huge driver for turnover.
Definitely. And these managers, the sources say, might even actively create division, unhealthy competition among their own team members.
Why would they do that? Often as a tactic to consolidate their own power. Divide and conquer.
But that just weakens the whole team, right? Undermines cohesion, trust.
Completely. Long term, it's terrible for productivity. It fosters this really unhealthy, distrustful environment.
And it goes beyond just leadership style, doesn't it? The blame shifting we talked about.
Right. That constant evasion of responsibility, always pointing fingers. It creates this pervasive frustration. People feel unsafe, always worried they'll be the next scapegoat. Stress levels go way up.
Psychological safety just evaporates.
Exactly. And then there's the ethical dimension.
Yeah, what do the sources say about that?
A general disregard for ethical standards seems common. The focus is purely on personal goals, often at the expense of ethics or even the law, which can lead to serious problems for the organization down the line.
Legal issues, reputational damage.
All of that. The sources also mention power harassment specifically.
Like bullying.
Yeah, misusing authority, demeaning comments, psychological manipulation, intimidation. It's all part of creating that toxic environment that pushes people out.
It sounds like a relentless pattern, and that core lack of empathy seems central to it all. They just don't see or don't care about the damage they're doing.
That seems to be the case. They often disregard employees' emotional needs, practical needs. People feel isolated, alienated.
No support, no real feedback.
Right. Which hinders growth, makes people feel undervalued, and again, fuels turnover. If you feel invisible or stuck, you'll look elsewhere.
It's this negative cycle. Lack of empathy leads to damaging behavior, which drives good people away.
And think about trust. Broken promises, betrayals. The sources mention how this erodes trust not just with the manager, but across the team. Communication breaks down, stress increases.
Trust is fundamental. Without it, everything falls apart.
It really does. Collaboration suffers, the organization becomes less resilient, and that unhealthy competition we mentioned, pitting people against each other, that just amplifies stress, leads to burnout.
This sounds exhausting. And what about long-term careers for people working under someone like this?
Often quite limited. The sources suggest these managers might actively block subordinates' growth. Take their credit, restrict opportunities.
So people realize there's no future for them there.
Exactly. If you see your path blocked, your contributions ignored, you start looking for the exit. It's a natural response. And this ties into broader organizational dysfunction too, eroded ethics, low morale, It all feeds into turnover.
It really sounds systemic, often starting at the top and poisoning the culture.
It can be. And finally, the sources point out the lack of basic support systems. If a manager isn't providing resources, feedback, guidance, it just increases stress and pushes people towards the door.
A supportive manager is so critical.
Absolutely. Without it, people feel lost, ill-equipped.
Okay, so given this pretty stark picture of the damage, what can organizations actually do? Are there practical ways to manage this, to mitigate the impact, especially on turnover?
The sources do suggest several proactive things. Robust, regular feedback systems are key.
To catch early warnings.
Yeah, and to really understand employee experiences. Also, leadership development programs, but ones that specifically focus on empathy, ethical decision-making, inclusive management.
Actively building a better leadership culture.
Exactly. And strengthening internal audits can help catch unethical behavior or power abuses that might signal these traits in leaders.
So systems of accountability plus actively fostering empathy and ethics. Now, there's a more controversial point in the sources, this idea that maybe some psychopathic traits could actually be useful in certain business roles.
Yes, that's a delicate point, and the sources definitely acknowledge the ethical tightrope here.
Right.
But they do raise the possibility that in very specific, narrow contexts, certain traits might be advantageous, like high-stakes crisis management.
Where being unemotional under pressure is key.
Potentially, yes. The ability to make cold, hard decisions quickly, or in certain strategic roles requiring really bold risk-taking, maybe that lack of emotional burden could be seen as a plus in some situations.
In very specific, high-pressure moments.
Very specific. The sources also mention high-level negotiations, emotional detachment, strategic thinking, maybe even persuasive manipulation could be seen as tools to get a desired outcome.
And maybe gaining a competitive edge, that cold focus.
That's another area I mentioned. That intense drive, the strategic perspective unclouded by empathy, potentially useful for outmaneuvering competitors. And this is a huge but...
Needs massive oversight.
Absolutely critical. Rigorous oversight, strict ethical controls. The potential for harm is still massive and has to be weighed incredibly carefully against any perceived benefit. It's high risk.
A very precarious balance indeed. Okay, shifting gears slightly. Digitalization. Remote work, online platforms. How does that change things? Does it make this easier or harder to deal with?
It's complex, according to the sources.
Okay.
On one hand, remote work, online communication. It can unfortunately create new opportunities for manipulation and hiding things.
Less face-to-face observation.
Exactly. Harder to pick up on behavioral cues. And the sort of anonymity of online platforms might embolden some manipulative tactics.
So it could actually make it easier to deceive or exploit people without the usual social checks and balances.
That's the concern, yeah. Using digital channels to spread rumors, sow discord in remote teams, engage in unethical stuff with less perceived risk of getting caught immediately.
So organizations need new strategies for this online world.
Definitely. Robust digital monitoring tools, clear ethical guidelines for online interaction, strong governance for remote work. It's becoming crucial.
A new front in managing these behaviors. What about the formal structures, like legal regulations? How much can they help?
They're essential, foundational. The sources stress we absolutely need legal protections against harassment, discrimination, fraud, things that might be more common around individuals with these traits.
And contracts, disciplinary action.
Yes, embedding clear ethical expectations and consequences in employment contracts is important, and consistently applying disciplinary measures when rules are broken is vital for accountability.
So clear rules, clear consequences. But the sources also suggest laws alone aren't enough.
That's a key point. Laws often target the really obvious, provable offenses. They might miss the subtler manipulation, the psychological harm, the slow erosion of trust.
Right, the stuff that's harder to legislate.
Exactly. So the sources emphasize a multi-layered approach. Legal compliance, yes, but combined with strong internal controls, employee training to raise awareness, solid whistleblower protections.
So people feel safe speaking up.
Crucial. And embedding a really strong ethical culture throughout the whole organization, it has to go beyond just ticking legal boxes.
Cultivating a genuinely supportive environment. Looking ahead, what might the future hold? Any potential developments in how we respond?
The sources hint at a few things. Technology, maybe AI, could potentially play a bigger role in identifying patterns. Analyzing communication data for warning signs.
Interesting. Ethically tricky, though.
Very. We might also see legal frameworks evolve, maybe becoming more specific about addressing these risks, even without clear illegal acts. and potentially greater corporate accountability for basically letting these situations fester.
So it's an evolving field. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the absolute key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the most vital message is just recognizing that corporate psychopathy is real. It's not just movie villains. These traits exist in workplaces, and they can have a profoundly negative, destructive impact.
Yeah.
And crucially, when good employees leave organizations, we shouldn't just assume it's job hopping. Often it's about being pushed out by toxic environments, frequently created or worsened by individuals with these traits.
Right, it reframes that whole narrative. It's not always about the individual leaving, but the environment they're forced to leave.
Precisely. And that leads us to think more broadly about the kinds of environments we're building.
In workplaces and beyond.
Exactly. The sources implicitly push us towards building spaces, workplaces, communities where diverse human traits, including neurodivergent traits, aren't seen as vulnerabilities to be exploited. Instead, they should be understood, valued, maybe even seen as strengths.
A call for more inclusive, more empathetic structures where manipulation doesn't thrive. That feels like a really important point. So, on that note, I'll leave you with this final thought to consider. What are the hidden costs? The cost to people's well-being, to productivity, to the overall health of our organizations, when leadership values cold, self-serving ambition over genuine empathy and ethical behavior? Something to reflect on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.